in this debate. We said that the state should not have a monopoly on knowledge production. We don't think that there has to be, Mr. Speaker, evaluation of whether or not certain forms of knowledge and information are valid or useful to society before you've even embarked on the study. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that before the study has even begun, you have already made evaluation as to whether or not society can be served by that. We don't think that the policy of affirmative bench is principally correct. We don't think that it is socially beneficial. We don't think that this is at all a good thing. I'm going to talk about three things for you today. First, why exactly current funding is not enough according to their model. Second, whether or not the idea that more knowledge is pollution is something I'd like to discuss. And third, I want to talk about how this harms the very existence of academic research. Rebuttal will be integrated. To the first thing, is there a state imperative to do this, right? Like, we don't think that there is a real reason for the state to make this sort of blanket ban, because there is research that the government simply cannot and does not provide for. There are several reasons for this. The first one probably being the idea of a lack of resources, which they've already conceded. But more to the point, there is also research that doesn't get pursued simply because there are often political considerations that block getting these states funding, right? Like often, Mr. Speaker, there are considerations that provide states with little to no incentive to engage in it. That is why it takes a lot of time for you to be able to get funding across the House Appropriations Committee for a project like stem cell research or perhaps some gene therapy research. Like, these are not things that the state can appropriate money for, not just because there is a limited amount of resources, but also because politicos often have an incentive to simply pander to the majority will that this side of the House seems to think is most important. We think that letting knowledge production be controlled by political considerations not only backtracks the promotion of a social good, but also limits the discourse on what that social good is to begin with. While we would agree that most corporations are self-interested, we contest the idea that academics are not self-interested when they are seeking glory. We contest the idea that NGOs are not, Mr. Speaker, self-interested when they are seeking to bring down other actors in society. And we contest the idea that politicians aren't self-interested either. Therefore, their main line of contention actually doesn't really stand. What we do think, Mr. Speaker, is that these individuals have every incentive to try and block things simply because they are unpopular, regardless of the social good. Therefore, we think that the state has a responsibility to encourage research, regardless of who it comes from, instead of trying to deny access to this research before it's even begun. Let's talk about the second thing. Is the knowledge produced really simply a pollutant in the political discourse? Like, we've already foreshadowed that we don't think anyone really exists for no self-interest. Because that's really how it works. Like, everybody has an advocacy. That's how it goes, right? Imran's entire speech is premised on the idea that more knowledge is good, except for knowledge that are stumbled upon as a result of corporate funding. And their main line of analysis for why they are bad is because corporations have a lot of money. What we would suggest, Mr. Speaker, is that given the fact that these corporations have a lot of money, and they say that corporations are going to be able to conduct their own research outside of the academe, the economic machinery that they are so afraid of, Mr. Speaker, will still be able to conduct research and perhaps make falsified claims, which can no longer be peer-reviewed, which no longer goes through the academe. At the end of the day, if they're afraid of research being skewed in a certain direction, these corporations are more likely to have the space to be able to skew that research and to be able to accomplish these reprehensible things in a paradigm wherein they are not working with another entity who has more ethical standards with regard to how they conduct research. If that is the claim, it's worse on their side. So Hannah then says that it's not about the falsification of statistics, it's not about the falsification of scientific knowledge, right? So we can therefore then assume that some of the things that corporate funding does come about with are true. So basically, they actually have a problem with entrenching the truth, right? Because they said it's not about the corporations lying or academicians lying. It's about the entrenchment of what has already been generally believed. And if that were the case, we don't think there's really a problem with the truth being promoted to the rest of society. We don't think, therefore, that if that were the case, this is actually a harm. To the third thing, which is most important, the idea of how this affects the calculus with regard to knowledge production. Because universities and think tanks do not have a they have a limited pot from which they can get resources from. And you see this, Mr. Speaker, in certain instances, like they slash funding for graduate students or general studying. You see this, Mr. Speaker, in the idea that they focus less practical fields in funding the academe. That's why grad students and members of the academe often serve as cautionary tales to the rest of us that you shouldn't pursue this because there isn't enough money, and most of the time these people are begging for grants. Basically, Mr. Speaker, what you will have in the calculus of those who allocate funding will be they would want to bank on the sure things, right? Like they're not going to be willing to take the risk. It's no longer going to be simply about what is morally acceptable to them and things like that. It's about trying to get a sure return on the investment that you've already made. Because if the returns are too uncertain, which is often the case in scientific research and requires repetitively failing, which is also often the case in scientific research, before you do succeed, the only individuals who will be able to take that, the only individuals who will take that risk are those entities that are capable of doing so. Basically meaning the fact that they have a lot of money is basically the main reason why they would more likely to take that risk and make that leap. The question then becomes, Mr. Speaker, is there even going to be a is there going to be significant academic research without corporate funding, right? Because what we would suggest is that wouldn't be the case. And the added benefit of having corporate funding in this regard would be at the very least all of the advocacies they wanted to promote would then have more money because the opportunity cost would have been less in order for them to be able to get some level of investment from the university or the think tank that would want to conduct this research. We completely disagree with the idea that corporations have no rights. Because basically, what she said is that because a corporation is not a person, and because you tax corporations, they therefore have no rights. Like, we tax people too, right? Like, these things are entities, they do have rights as well. This is just completely absurd. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that there can or should be a determination of the value of knowledge before that knowledge is even produced. We think that corporations have a perfectly legitimate right in trying to claim that their facts are true, and that these facts, Mr. Speaker, can be verifiable. Most of the time, these are the kinds of corporations and legal entities that are perfectly willing to take on those risks, such as that of stem cell research, because the general public is not going to be into that, and therefore politicians wouldn't want to fund it. But universities also wouldn't really be into that unless they have like a zillion, billion, trillion dollars, because these are unsure returns. But you will have corporations and Genentech and all of these companies who would want to invest in that sort of research precisely because they know that even if they lose a lot of money now, there might be some returns in the future. So what you do have, Mr. Speaker, is not only better general knowledge production, but you also have a society that benefits from these things as well. What we would suggest is that the other side of the house saying that, well, you know, we would have antiretroviral drugs anyway as a result, regardless of whether or not corporate funding is there, is a bit of a myth, right? Because at the end of the day, all of these things, Mr. Speaker, are spurred forward as a result of money being available. What you will have is either, even if we do get all of these benefits as a result of the policy of affirmative, what you will have is that it will take slower, it will take longer, we're all going to have to suffer. We are proud to oppose.